Chapter 1. The garden that heard a whistle. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Kettlebury, and the vicarage garden was in a state of mild but cheerful disarray. The parish roof fund had managed to wrangle together another spring garden fete, and, despite the predictable drizzle earlier in the morning, the sun had seen fit to reappear in time for Miss Marple, wrapped in a fine but practical dove-gray shawl, sat quietly beneath the ancient fig tree near the edge of the lawn, her knitting in hand and a cup of tea cooling beside her. She was not fond of garden chairs, which she claimed did nothing for one's posture, but she enjoyed watching the ebb and flow of village life from a slightly removed vantage point. Nearby, bunting fluttered like tired butterflies anchored between trees and fence posts. The table bearing Mrs. Pendlebury's strawberry jam scones had already been visited heavily, as evidenced by the telltale red smudges on several children's cheeks. A few older gentlemen were huddled near the punch, debating cricket scores with the strange civility that came from years of pretending to like each other. Women in floral prints mingled about in clusters, exchanging remarks with exaggerated innocence. "It's the third time this month she's worn that hat," whispered Mrs. Clegg to her companion, not noticing Miss Marple within earshot. "I suppose it must be a favorite," replied the other lady delicately. Miss Marple's needles clicked in her lap. When people wear something 3 times in 1 month, it is either newly acquired or associated with something they wish to remember or occasionally forget, she murmured without looking up. The 2 women blinked and muttered something about how sharp the breeze had turned. But it wasn't the breeze that unsettled Kettlebury that afternoon. At precisely 4:30, just as the sun slid behind a wisp of cloud and cast the vicarage lawn in a slightly subdued glow, a whistle sliced through the air. A thin, high-pitched, note-long, single, and unmistakably eerie dot. It came from the house. The laughter and chatter paused. Children glanced up from their biscuits. The curate frowned, balancing a cup of lemon barley on one knee. "Odd kettle, that," muttered Reverend Allworthy, rising slowly. "Perhaps something's boiled over." But Miss Marple was already setting aside her knitting. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were sharp as ever. She reached the French doors just behind the vicar. The drawing-room beyond was empty. At first glance, the scent of hyacinths wafting faintly from a vase on the sideboard. Afternoon light struck the polished surfaces and glimmered faintly on the edges of porcelain cups. And there, slumped behind the armchair near the window, lay Lavinia Crowthorne. Mrs. Lavinia Crowthorne, wife of the village solicitor, was not the sort one noticed easily. A quiet woman, timid in social gatherings, often in the background of her husband Edwin's booming orations about everything from property taxes to the merits of Gilbert and Sullivan. She was slight, with eyes too large for her face, and a habit of folding her hands as if expecting to be reprimanded. Now she lay twisted on the rug in a posture that spoke of neither rest nor sleep. Her mouth was slightly ajar. Her eyes, open but glazed, stared up toward the molding. One of her shoes had slipped from her foot. Reverend Allworthy inhaled sharply. "Good Lord!" Miss Marple moved with silent precision, kneeling beside the body. She checked for a pulse at the neck, then the wrist. Nothing. Her gaze traveled to the teacup resting untouched on the side table, and then, just above it, to the ceramic sugar bowl, shaped like a robin. It was an unusual thing, delicate, painted, with small brush strokes of brown and orange, eyes wide and glossy. Its lid sat askew. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. Edwin Crowthorne entered in a puff of heat and confusion. "Lavinia?" he called before seeing her body. "Lavinia? What in God's name?" Reverend Allworthy stepped forward. "We only just discovered her, Miss Marple, and the doctor has been sent for." Crowthorne knelt, touching his wife's cold cheek. "She was just here. I saw her 10 minutes ago near the tea-table." "Did she mention feeling unwell?" Miss Marple asked gently. He shook his head violently. "No. She said she was going inside for a moment. Something about needing to sit." Dr. Sykes arrived not long after, summoned with unusual urgency by Mrs. Pendlebury's son on his bicycle. After a cursory examination, he looked up gravely. "She's dead. Likely no more than 15 minutes. I can't say more until we've performed a proper post-mortem, but there's something unnatural here." Crowthorne recoiled. "What? Are you saying, doctor?" "I'm saying she didn't fall from weakness. There are no bruises, no signs of injury. But look at the color of her lips. Cyanotic. I suspect poisoning. Likely in her tea." The hush that followed those words was heavy and unnerving. From the garden, through the open doors, came the faint voices of villagers still unaware of what had occurred. Miss Marple stepped once more toward the sugar bowl. It looked untouched, but something about it seemed wrong, a faint smudge on the rim, as though it had been opened and closed hastily. The whistle, that strange, unnatural sound. Not a bird call, not a kettle. Could it have come from here? Poor Lavinia, murmured Reverend Allworthy. She was so harmless. Miss Marple's expression remained neutral. "Harmlessness," she said quietly, "is not always a protection." She moved toward the window, glancing again toward the lawn where Edwin had stood laughing earlier, the too loud voice, the too tight waistcoat, and Lavinia nowhere in sight. No. One had seen her re-enter the house. No one had followed her, and yet she had died within minutes of leaving the garden. "A tragedy," said Dr. Sykes, "but until we know what substance killed her, we must not touch anything in this room." "I quite agree," said Miss Marple. "The robin-shaped sugar." Bowl stared back from the mantel with its bright, unblinking eyes. Chapter 2. The village reacts. By the following morning, the village of Kettlebury had transformed in the way only small villages could quietly, efficiently, and without anyone admitting they had changed at all. The postmistress, Mrs. Finch, had mentioned the word poison before her kettle had even finished boiling for the morning's first cup. Mr. Halberd, the grocer, told 3 customers before 10 o'clock that the tea at the vicarage had tasted odd, though he hadn't attended the fete at all. And young Elsie Carter, who had been helping with the bunting, was now certain she had seen a greenish tinge in Mrs. Crowthorne's tea, though Miss Marple, present throughout, recalled no such thing. In St. Mary Mead, news was a bird that could fly without wings. By midday, everyone knew Lavinia Crowthorne was dead, and everyone had a theory. It was the jam, insisted Mrs. Pendlebury in hushed tones to Mrs. Clegg near the butcher's queue. "I always tell people not to take jam after it's been left out. That kind of exposure, it breeds bacteria." Mrs. Clegg, who had taken 2 scones at the fete, paled slightly. "But wouldn't we all be ill then?" "Unless," said Mrs. Pendlebury ominously, Someone tampered with one pot. Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Reverend Allworthy was pacing across the study carpet while the curate, Mr. Finch, attempted to organize the press of visitors' inquiries, and one particularly eager reporter from the Midshire Gazette, Miss Marple, having returned her knitting to its basket for the day, sat with a cup of tea not from the vicarage set. She noted and listened. It was remarkable how grief, when filtered through community curiosity, could sound so much like speculation wrapped in sympathy. She was a dear soul, said Mrs. Hargreaves with a sniff, dabbing at her eyes, though they were quite dry. Quiet, meek, never raised her voice once. But of course one never knows what goes on behind closed doors, do they? Indeed, Miss Marple said mildly. Sometimes the most quiet of households hold the loudest secrets. Mrs. Hargreaves blinked. You don't mean to say? I don't mean to say anything, Miss Marple replied, sipping her tea. I simply mean that one must listen not just to words, but to silences. A knock came at the study door. It was Inspector Graves from the County Constabulary, tall, clean-shaven, and with the expression of a man who disliked mésalliances, in crime or otherwise. He had already interviewed the Reverend, and now wished to speak to Edwin Crowthorne. The solicitor arrived looking haggard. His waistcoat, so pristine the day before, was slightly crumpled. He wore a black tie, hastily knotted. His face was pale beneath his ruddy complexion. I can't believe it, he muttered as he sank into a chair. Lavinia gone. The inspector, who had heard such phrases before, nodded politely. We understand this was sudden. We're treating the case as suspicious, Mr. Crowthorne. Suspicious. Edwin's face darkened. You mean to say someone did this deliberately? We don't say anything yet. The post-mortem will tell us more. Miss Marple, from her corner seat, looked up. May I ask, Mr. Crowthorne, whether your wife had any enemies? He blinked at her. Lavinia? Enemies? Certainly not. She was liked by everyone. Shy, yes, but never unfriendly. Did she seem troubled lately? Nervous, perhaps? He hesitated, then shook his head. No more than usual. She was always delicate. That's why I asked her not to overexert herself with the fate, but she insisted. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she did seem particularly quiet yesterday, almost as if she were listening for something. The room stilled slightly at the remark. The inspector jotted something down. Can you think of anyone who might wish her harm? Edwin gave a weak laugh. Inspector, we're not in a crime. Novel. People don't wish each other dead in places like this. They gossip, yes, they hold grudges, perhaps. But they don't kill. No, Miss Marple said gently. I once knew a woman who poisoned her husband with rhubarb leaves because he laughed at her sponge cake. It took the police 6 weeks to believe it wasn't an accident. No one quite knew how to respond to that. The interview concluded, and Edwin was excused. As he left the study, Miss Marple watched him keenly. He was not weeping. His hands were steady, but he had not asked a single question about the investigation. Out in the garden, the freight decorations had been taken down, though a bit of bunting still fluttered near the rose arch. The robin-shaped sugar bowl had been collected as evidence, and Dr. Sykes had taken the remaining tea sample with him. Miss Marple lingered by the French doors. The wind stirred a single serviette left on the tablecloth. All the while that eerie whistle echoed in her mind one long, high-pitched note like a bird that had forgotten how to sing. A whistle could come from many places, of course. A kettle, a teapot's vent, even a child's toy, but no one had claimed to see a kettle boil, and no child had been inside Dot. Miss Marple remembered how Lavinia's teacup had remained untouched. Not even a ring at the bottom. Had she intended to drink it all, or had someone stopped her? Behind her, Inspector Graves appeared again. "I'll be interviewing the other guests next. I understand you were among the first to find her?" Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed. But I wouldn't dream of interfering, Inspector." Graves hesitated. "Interfering isn't the word I'd use, Miss Marple. From what I hear, you have a reputation." She inclined her head modestly. "One tries." He nodded slowly, then said, "Let me ask you this. What's your instinct?" Miss Marple looked out toward the garden, then toward the house. Her eyes were bright. "My instinct," she said softly, "is that someone at the fete didn't come for jam or for charity. They came to watch something end." Graves stared at her. "And what ended, exactly?" Miss Marple's smile faded. Someone's control over Lavinia Crowthorne. Chapter 3. First suspects, Inspector Graves, practical to the core, began his interviews at once. By the following afternoon, most of Kettlebury's more prominent fete attendees had been called into the modest drawing-room of the vicarage, which now functioned rather awkwardly as the village's temporary investigative hub. It was Mrs. Pendlebury who arrived first, clutching her handbag like it might try to escape. "I can't imagine what help I'll be," she said as she settled into the floral wingback chair, "but I do think it's my duty to cooperate." Graves folded his arms. "You were near the tea table most of the afternoon?" "I was on the tea table, Inspector," she replied tartly. "At least metaphorically. Those scones didn't arrange themselves. Did you see Mrs. Crowthorne return to the house before she died?" Mrs. Pendlebury pursed her lips. "I saw her speaking to Mrs. Hargreaves near the plum cordial around 4. She looked rather strained, come to think of it. I assume she was simply tired. That woman never did have much of a constitution. And afterward, I noticed her step away toward the French doors. She said something about needing to rest inside. I didn't think anything of it. I had a jam crisis at the time. Someone had left a spoon in the black rat dish. Twice." Graves made a note. "Did she have tea before she went in?" "No, I recall quite clearly. She declined it. She always said tea gave her palpitations." Miss Marple, seated nearby with her hands folded in her lap, tilted her head. "And yet her cup was full on the side table," she murmured. Mrs. Pendlebury blinked. "Was it? Perhaps someone else brought it to her?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied. "The next visitor was Mrs. Hargreaves, a broad-shouldered woman with a brassy tone and the kind of confidence that came from being the butcher's wife, and, therefore, by default, someone with the freshest gossip in Kettlebury. I don't know why everyone's acting surprised," she said as she dropped into the same chair Mrs. Pendlebury had recently vacated. "That marriage was a quiet battlefield. You could feel it." Inspector Graves lifted an eyebrow. "In what way?" "She never said a word unless he spoke first, always watching him like a dog waiting for permission. And Edwin Crowthorne is not a man you interrupt. Sharp tongue, that one." "Did you witness any argument at the fete?" "No," she admitted, "but she looked frightened when I mentioned the letter." Graves's pencil paused mid-sentence. "What letter?" Mrs. Hargreaves sat up straighter. "Oh, I assumed you knew." "Silly me. Well, a few days ago I dropped by the Crowthorne house with some lamb cutlets." She opened the door herself, and in her hand was a crumpled bit of paper looked like a letter. Her face had gone all blotchy, like she'd had a shock. When I asked if she was all right, she stuffed it in her sleeve. Miss Marple, who had said nothing during the conversation, now looked up. "And did she say anything? Anything unusual?" Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated. "Only this. He said he'd never write again. Not after last time." Then she looked like she regretted saying it. Inspector Graves leaned back in his chair. "And you're sure it wasn't a note from Edwin? I'd be surprised. He dictates everything to poor Alice at the firm. Won't even write out his own birthday cards." As Mrs. Hargreaves left, she passed Edwin Crowthorne, himself in the hall. He looked exhausted, his collar slightly askew, and the usual pomp of his stride was gone. Still he managed a weak smile at Miss Marple, who was now peering at the bookshelf. Beside the hearth, apparently engrossed in a 1937 gardening almanac. "Inspector," he said, entering with the weariness of a man far too used to being in control. "Any progress?" Graves motioned to the seat. "We're making inquiries. I'd like to revisit something. Your wife, did she keep correspondence? Letters, diaries, anything of the sort?" Crowthorne's brows drew together. "Not that I know of. Lavinia wasn't the sort for that. She preferred embroidery to introspection." Miss Marple turned from the shelf. "And yet she did write letters. I saw one once at the Women's Guild luncheon. She had a tidy, meticulous hand. Narrow loops on her G's, a precise, almost nervous script." Crowthorne gave her a startled look. "You remember her handwriting?" "I remember a great many things," she said simply. "For instance, I remember she wore blue nearly every day, except last Sunday. She wore gray, a soft cloud-colored wool." "She did," he admitted. "She said she didn't feel herself." "No," said Miss Marple. "I imagine she didn't." Graves cleared his throat. Was she expecting any correspondence? Something that might have upset her? "No," Crowthorne said quickly. Then, after a pause, "Not that she mentioned. Though now you bring it up, she did seem distracted of late. Once or twice I found her standing in the hall by the front door, just ... waiting. For someone?" He shook his head. "No one ever came." After he left, Miss Marple remained silent for several minutes. The inspector, used to her timing, by now waited patiently. Then she said, "Do you suppose a person can die from dread, Inspector?" He frowned. "You believe she was frightened?" "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, "that Lavinia Crowthorne had been holding her breath for a very long time, waiting for a past that finally caught up with her." The room fell quiet again. Out the window, Kettlebury went about its day hedges clipped. Dogs walked, curtains twitched. No one knew what the letter had said. No one knew who had sent it, but someone in Kettlebury did know. And Miss Marple, with her quiet observations and gentle voice, intended to find out. To be continued in Chapter 4, A Hidden Clue. Would you like Chapter 4 generated next at 1,200 words? Chapter 4, A Hidden Clue. The following day, the clouds over Kettlebury hung lower than usual, casting a pearly gray light over the cobbled lanes and dampening the early roses. Miss Marple, undeterred by the threat of drizzle, made her way to the Crowthorne residence, with the quiet resolve of someone who had no official business, yet always managed to uncover the essential ones. It was a modest house, far less grand than Edwin Crowthorne's voice often implied. Ivy crawled up the brickwork, and a few pale peonies drooped in the front garden as if mourning alongside the drapes now drawn tight in every window. The black crape on the door was slightly crooked, as though someone had placed it there in a hurry. Miss Marple stood for a moment observing. The curtains in the front parlor didn't quite meet. A narrow triangle of daylight led through. She noticed a faint shimmer of a movement, perhaps a figure stepping back from the window. A house in grief didn't always behave as one expected. Some remained still. Others moved too much. She knocked. Gently. After a long pause, the door opened to reveal Alice Briar, Edwin's long-suffering secretary, now red-eyed and frazzled. Her presence here, rather than at the office, surprised no one who knew Edwin's sense of entitlement. "Oh, Miss Marple, he's not here. Gone to speak with the coroner again." "That's quite all right, dear. I was hoping to speak with you." Alice hesitated. Her hands, ink-stained as always, fidgeted with the buttons on her cardigan. "About what?" Miss Marple stepped inside without quite waiting for permission, though her voice remained gentle. "About Lavinia. And perhaps about something she may have received before she died." Alice led her into the parlor, where the atmosphere was heavy with lavender polish and something less pleasant underneath old despair, perhaps. A half-emptied box of tissues sat beside a decorative clock on the mantel. On a nearby armchair lay a pale gray shawl folded neatly, the sort of item that still retained the shape of the woman who once wore it. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it. She liked that one, Alice said quietly. Said it reminded her of early mornings. "In Devon? You were close, then?" Alice looked conflicted. "Not close, no, but I think she trusted me, in small ways. She didn't say much, but she often didn't need to." Miss Marple sat, placing her hands in her lap. "Mrs. Hargreaves mentioned a letter. One Lavinia seemed unsettled by." Alice flinched. "Yes, I saw it, too. Or rather, I saw her holding it. She was trembling. She didn't say what it was. She said he said he'd never write again, that's all. Then she folded it and slipped it into a book." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "A book? Do you remember which?" Alice looked toward the shelf. "Second from the top, near the end. One of the gardening ones. She used to read them when she couldn't sleep." Miss Marple rose and stepped lightly to the bookshelf. Her finger ran along the spines until it stopped at the English Flower Garden, 1935 edition. She removed it, opened the pages gently, and there it was, a folded sheet, creased, slightly yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was bold and uneven, unmistakably masculine. She read silently. "Lavinia, I said I would never write. But silence has its own cost, and you know too well what we buried. If you tell him, he'll never forgive you. But I think he suspects already. Meet me. Same place as before." Miss Marple folded the letter again and slipped it back where it had been found. "Alice," she said softly, "do you know who A might be?" Alice's expression told her everything. She did know, but didn't feel it was her place to say, "I believe you may know more than you're comfortable admitting," Miss Marple said gently. But you needn't say anything just now. You've helped. Enough by showing me this." Alice looked visibly relieved, though her fingers continued to twist at her sleeve. Before leaving, Miss Marple asked one final question. "Did Lavinia have any visitors last week? Unexpected ones?" Alice nodded reluctantly. "One. A man, tall, gray coat. I never caught his name. She wouldn't let me announce him. Said it was someone she used to know. He stayed 15 minutes. And how did she seem afterward?" "Shaken. She dropped a cup in the kitchen after he left. That never happened before." Miss Marple took her leave, her mind already whirring with connections. She returned home to find a note pushed under her door. It was from Inspector Graves. "Miss Marple, please come at once. Something's turned up at the surgery. The sugar bowl is not just a sugar bowl. Half an hour later, they stood in the cold examination room behind Dr. Sykes's surgery. Graves looked unusually pale. Dr. Sykes held the robin-shaped bowl with a pair of gloves, his expression strained. "This is quite remarkable," he said. "There's a tiny mechanism inside the base, a whistle of sorts activated by heat." "Heat?" Graves asked. "Yes. When the bowl is filled with something warm tea, for instance, the base expands and triggers the sound." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So it wasn't a random sound. It was a signal." Graves looked at her. "You believe it was deliberate?" "I believe," she said, "that someone wanted to know when she touched the sugar whether she would use it. Perhaps they counted on it. Perhaps that whistle was the trigger that confirmed everything was in motion." Graves frowned. "But she didn't drink the tea." "No," Miss Marple said, "and that may be the only reason we know it was murder." She turned to the inspector, her voice soft but certain. Someone in this village knew that Bowl would whistle, and they were listening. Chapter 5. Confrontations and Secrets. Inspector Graves sat alone in the study of the vicarage, turning the sugar bowl over in his gloved hands. Even now, knowing what they knew, the little robin's painted eyes gave nothing away. Its innocent design seemed to mock the idea that something so delicate could hold malice in its hollow body. Miss Marple had left the surgery earlier that afternoon with her usual quiet purpose. She had not voiced any conclusions, not yet, but Graves had learned that when she became particularly polite, it usually meant she was getting very close to something. And indeed, she had gone straight to Mrs. Hargreaves, the butcher's wife, was busy arranging chrysanthemums in the front window when Miss Marple arrived, her sleeves rolled up and her lips pressed tight, as if the mere suggestion of crime in Kettlebury had spoiled her entire flower-bed. "I thought you might come," Mrs. Hargreaves said, not looking up. "They always say you have a nose for this sort of thing." "I only have ears, mostly," Miss Marple said, stepping into the parlor. "And sometimes people don't realize how much they say, especially when they think no one is listening." Mrs. Hargreaves dropped a chrysanthemum into the vase with more force than was necessary. "If this is about that letter, I've told everything I know." "Have you?" Miss Marple said mildly. "Because you mentioned it was crumpled. That's not how one usually receives a letter, unless, of course, it had already been read once by someone else." The older woman turned, eyes narrowing. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting Lavinia Crowthorne may not have opened that letter herself, that someone else might have intercepted it, read it first, before slipping it back into her hands." Mrs. Hargreaves folded her arms. And who do you think would do such a thing? Possibly someone who feared what was inside, or someone who already knew what was inside, and needed to know how much she had read. The butcher's wife said nothing for a long moment. Then she let out a breath through her nose and returned to the vase. You have your theories, Miss Marple, but I don't meddle in other people's post, and I don't like being accused. Miss Marple tilted her head. Then perhaps you might help in a different way. Do you recall anyone else who might have known Lavinia before she arrived? And Kettlebury? Any old acquaintances? Men from her youth? Mrs. Hargreaves snorted. Lavinia? She had the charm of a tea towel, bless her. No one ever courted her that I knew of. She appeared out of nowhere, and Edwin snapped her up fast. Odd if you think about it. Yes, Miss Marple said. Quite odd. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the one place where every secret in Kettlebury eventually surfaced, the hairdresser. Agnes Polly's salon sat between the post office and the bakery. On any given day, you could find at least one woman under a dryer, and two more pretending they weren't listening to the conversations swirling around them. When Miss Marple arrived, Agnes herself was trimming the fringe of Elsie Carter, who had been unusually quiet for a girl known mostly for giggling at everything. Miss Marple, Agnes beamed. Come for a wash or just wisdom today? Just a bit of wisdom, I think, said Miss Marple as she perched delicately on the waiting bench. I was hoping you could remind me, wasn't Lavinia Crowthorne once a teacher? Somewhere before she came here? Elsie's eyes flicked up in the mirror, but she said nothing. Agnes paused mid-snip. Now that you mention it, yes. I believe she taught at a school near Norbury. Someone mentioned it at the last WI meeting. Not many details, mind you. And? Did she leave suddenly? Agnes looked thoughtful. I can't say. She never spoke much about her life before Edwin. Always seemed eager to keep the past behind her. At that moment, Elsie let out a sudden noise, half cough, half gasp. She'd gone pink in the face. Something you'd like to add, my dear? Miss Marple asked gently. Elsie hesitated. I wasn't going to say anything. I didn't think. It mattered. Everything matters, Miss Marple said. Especially the things people decide not to say. The girl looked around as if checking that no one else was near. I was cleaning up after the fete. I went to clear some glasses from the sideboard in the vicarage, and I passed the drawing room. Mr. Crowthorne was inside. Miss Marple nodded. That's not surprising. He was whispering to someone. I thought it was Lavinia. But when I peeked through the crack in the door, he was alone. He was holding something, a letter, I think, and he looked furious. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Did you see him do anything with the letter? Elsie shook her head. He put it in his pocket. Then he said, she'll regret this. And that's all. Agnes gasped. He said that? I swear I heard it. Then he came out and saw me, smiled like nothing happened. Miss Marple stood slowly. Thank you, my dear. That may help more than you know. She returned to her cottage and sat for a long while with her teacup untouched. The events were aligning barely, but enough to form the edges of something much darker than village gossip. A whistle disguised as innocence. A letter written by a man who had promised never to write again. A secret Lavinia had kept hidden behind a marriage she endured more than embraced Dot and Edwin Crowthorne, who had said he didn't know of any letters had. Not just known, but raged over one dot. Miss Marple reached for her notebook and made a single note underlined in blue ink. The whistle wasn't the murder, it was the signal. Somewhere, someone had waited to hear that sound. Someone who knew that Lavinia would either take the sugar or refuse it. The game had not been in giving her poison. It had been in watching what she chose. Chapter 6. Another twist on Thursday morning. The sky over Kettlebury split with rain, fine and silvery like thread unraveling from a cloud. The village seemed quieter than usual, the streets glistening and empty, and the only sounds were the low rumble of carts on wet stone and the occasional clink of teacups in kitchens behind lace curtains dot at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple's own kettle whistled, a sound now sharpened by recent events. She moved slowly, thoughtfully, setting down the pot beside her breakfast tray. Her mind, as always, was busy with the seemingly unimportant, the temperature of the tea, the way the spoon had been left slightly damp in the sugar jar, the tone in Edwin Crowthorne's voice, when he had first cried out at the sight of his wife's body, Dot, so theatrical, yet without tremble, Dot so present, yet lacking urgency, Dot by 10 o'clock. She stepped out with her umbrella, heading not toward the vicarage nor the Crowthorne home, but to the far edge of the village, to the old bus stop beside the public allotments. There, waiting beneath the sagging wooden awning, was Inspector Graves. "I thought you'd be here," he said without looking at her, hands in his coat pockets. "You usually arrive before I realize I need you." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You received the autopsy report?" He nodded. Confirmed death by digitalis. A small, concentrated dose. Introduced through the sugar, likely. There were traces in the bowl, but the teacup was clean. "So she never drank it," Miss Marple murmured. "She hesitated, or she changed her mind." Graves turned toward her. "We also found fingerprints on the sugar bowl." "Edwin's?" "No, not his. A match came back to a man named Alaric Denham, former school teacher. Lost his position 15 years ago after an incident. No charges filed, but he vanished shortly afterward. Guess where he resurfaced?" Miss Marple's eyes darkened slightly. "Kettlebury. Came back under a false name. Lives in the cottage behind the Old Mill Road. Works odd jobs, keeps to himself. And according to witness accounts," Graves said slowly, "he attended the fete." Miss Marple closed her umbrella and stared out at the hedgerow. "And Lavinia taught at that school 15 years ago." Graves nodded. "It seems she was the one who gave the testimony that cost him his job. We're still pulling the old records." Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. She kept that secret all these years, even from Edwin. Or especially from Edwin. The rain began to ease. Graves continued. "We brought Denham in for questioning. He admitted to writing the letter. Then he was the man Alice saw." "Yes. He says he didn't harm Lavinia, only wanted to speak with her. Claims he wanted closure. That he gave her the letter and left. He denies touching the sugar bowl." Miss Marple turned slowly. "But his fingerprints are there." "Yes." She paused. "And his motive? Well, revenge. She ruined him. And if he saw her again after all these years, if she refused to help clear his name." Miss Marple held up a hand. It doesn't quite fit, does it? Revenge is a broad word, but the method here, poison in sugar, a whistling bowl, a delay in drinking, it's too subtle, too patient. Not the act of a man driven by old fury, but of someone watching, waiting, testing. Graves frowned. Testing. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. What if the poison wasn't intended to kill Lavinia outright? What if it was meant to see what she would do? If she would take the sugar, if she would trust the tea. Graves leaned back against the damp post. So the real intent was to observe her choice? Exactly. And if she refused the sugar, if she suspected something, it would mean she had been warned, or guilty. Graves exhaled slowly. And if she didn't take the sugar? Miss Marple gave a small nod. Then it would reveal that she feared someone, or something. It was a test of memory of fear. Graves went quiet. Finally, he said, Edwin still claiming complete ignorance of the letter. But we found a burnt envelope in the parlor fireplace, partially destroyed. Enough of the handwriting remained to match Denham's. So Edwin did read it, Miss Marple said. He knew. She stared out toward the dripping hedgerows, her voice turning thoughtful. Lavinia didn't drink the tea. The bowl whistled. And someone knew at that moment that she had been warned, that she might confess, that she might leave, and someone couldn't risk that. Graves added grimly. They stood for a long moment in silence, the quiet broken only by the sound of a bicycle bell in the distance and the drip of rain from the awning's edge. Then Miss Marple said, "You'll want to speak with Alice Briar again." Alice? Graves blinked. Why? Because she was with Edwin when the letter arrived. She knows more than she's said, and I believe she's afraid. But not of Alaric Denham. Graves straightened. Afraid of Edwin? Miss Marple said nothing. She simply opened her umbrella again as the rain began once more, and stepped off the path with the care of someone who always avoided puddles and never missed footprints. Chapter 7. Miss Marple's final test in Friday afternoon. Just as the church clock struck 3, Miss Marple prepared for company. She had spent the morning arranging her sitting room with deliberate charm, the lace cloth on the tea table freshly pressed, the fire lit against the lingering chill, and 2 matching porcelain cups placed just so. Outside, clouds gathered again like gossip in the sky, but inside Rose Cottage all was warmth and calm. Alice Briar was nervous when she arrived. Miss Marple welcomed her in with a smile. "Come in, dear, sit by the fire. The wind's gone right through me today." Alice complied with the stiffness of someone who had not slept well in days. Her eyes were shadowed, her blouse hastily tucked. "I'm not sure what more I can tell you," she said before the tea had even been poured. "The police already asked me everything." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "But it's not always about what people say, is it? Sometimes it's about what they saw or what they guessed." She handed Alice a cup, watched her hesitate, then take a sip. "I was thinking," Miss Marple continued, "about Lavinia's last few weeks. She seemed frightened, didn't she?" Alice's shoulders tensed. "She did," she admitted softly. "She jumped at small noises, spilled tea on her hands, and didn't even flinch. I offered to stay with her more than once, but she said she was almost ready. I didn't know what she meant." "Almost ready for what?" "I assumed ... to leave. She'd been talking about going away. A friend in Devon, perhaps. She never said it directly, but she was saving money in small amounts. Odd, really, since Edwin controlled most of the accounts. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. And she never told him? Oh, no. Alice shook her head. He would have, well, you've seen how he can be. Charming in public, but behind closed doors. Lavinia lived carefully. Miss Marple looked at the fire. Do you think he knew? Alice hesitated. Then, in a low voice, she said, he found the envelope, the one from Denham. I saw him holding it before the fete. He was pale, angry, but when I asked, he said it was nothing. Miss Marple nodded slowly, and that was the same day Lavinia died. Yes. Miss Marple set down her cup and gave Alice a long, thoughtful look. There's something I haven't told the inspector. Yet, she said. I've found another sugar bowl. Alice blinked. What? An identical one, robin-shaped, from the same pottery series. It was tucked in a locked drawer at the back of the Crowthorne study, beneath a stack of old bank ledgers. Curious. Place for it, wouldn't you say? Alice's voice caught. How did you? Oh, I didn't break in, my dear. But the vicar did invite me to assist with a charity records check yesterday, and while he was tending to a phone call, I found the drawer open. She paused. There were faint sugar granules inside the second bowl, but no whistle and no poison. Alice went very still. Miss Marple's voice softened. Lavinia knew she was being tested. She recognized the bowl. She placed her cup beside it, untouched, and left the signal, the whistle, knowing someone was listening, that someone would panic if she refused it. Alice shook her head. I don't understand. She was showing she'd made a choice, not to drink, not to stay. Miss Marple leaned in gently, but someone made a different choice. A long silence stretched between them. The fire popped once, sending up a small plume of smoke. Alice stared at the flames as though searching for something there. I didn't know he would do it, she whispered at last. I thought he'd just confront her, yell, maybe tear up the letter. But when I saw the sugar bowl, the second one, in his study weeks before, I realized he was preparing something. Miss Marple said nothing. He kept watching her. I saw him hold the whistle bowl in his hands like it was a tool, not a trinket. And you were afraid, Miss Marple said softly. Alice nodded. I should have said something. No, Miss Marple replied. You've said it now. That's what matters. Outside the clouds finally opened, and a gentle rain began to fall. It pattered against the windows, soft and rhythmic. There was a knock at the door. Inspector Graves entered, shaking off his coat and offering Alice a brief nod. I came when I received your message, he said to Miss Marple. You said there was something I needed to hear. There is, she replied. Alice has just confirmed Edwin Crowthorne had both the motive and the means. He found the letter, feared a confession, and prepared a test disguised as a kindness. Graves turned to Alice. Is that true? Alice closed her eyes, then nodded. I saw the second bowl. I heard him threaten Lavinia more than once. He said, if you ever humiliate me, I'll make you regret it quietly. Graves inhaled deeply. That's enough to bring him in. As he turned to go, Miss Marple added, he may claim the bowl was only decorative, but do check the receipt in his desk drawer. I believe you'll find it matches the date of Lavinia's birthday. Graves gave her a dry look. Of course it does. He left with the same quiet swiftness with which he'd arrived. Alice remained, seated, her hands clenched tightly around her empty teacup. Will they arrest him? Yes, Miss Marple said gently. But it won't be dramatic. Edwin Crowthorne will go quietly. He'll say nothing. He may even look relieved. Men like him always do when they've had to hold themselves in for too long. Alice looked up. And Lavinia? Miss Marple's expression softened. She knew more than she let on, and in the end she made a choice. That whistle, it wasn't just a sound. It was her last word. Chapter 8. The arrest of Edwin Crowthorne happened without scandal, without spectacle. Just after breakfast on Saturday morning, 2 uniformed constables arrived at his home with a quiet firmness that brooked no argument. Edwin did not protest. He offered no indignant denials, no outbursts of grief. He simply adjusted his cuffs, asked to retrieve his overcoat, and walked out of the house with the resigned dignity of a man caught in the final act of a play he had once written himself. Miss Marple, watching from a respectful distance near the vicarage gate, said nothing. Her shawl, gray and neat as always, was drawn tight across her shoulders. She did not gloat. She never did. But her eyes, beneath the modest hat brim, missed nothing. Not the barely concealed relief in Alice Briar's face as she stood at the edge of the walkway, nor the quickly drawn curtains in 2 windows across the square dot. By midday, word had traveled through Kettlebury like spilled ink. Poison, whispered Mrs. Pendlebury over the greengrocer's stall. Wouldn't surprise me, muttered Mr. Halberd, weighing out parsnips. Never trusted a man who called himself a tenor and didn't sing in church. Even Agnes Polly, down at the salon, was breathless with the implications. Imagine! Edwin Crowthorne, a murderer. And all over a letter, they say. Miss Marple heard it all as she passed through the village on her way to speak once more with Inspector Graves. She did not interrupt the gossip, nor correct its more fanciful details. It would fade in time, as all things did in villages like Kettlebury, with muttered disbelief, followed by cautious silence, and eventually replaced by the next scandal. At the station, Graves met her with the look of a man still untangling a very human knot. He won't admit to it, the inspector said. Says he was provoked. That Lavinia had dishonored him by keeping secrets. He claims he only wanted to frighten her. That the poison was never meant to be consumed. Miss Marple nodded. Which is likely true, but intent is a delicate thing, isn't it? Once a poison has been placed in a sugar bowl, it cannot unplace itself. Graves sighed. We'll have to charge him, of course. And the second bowl, the whistle mechanism sealed it. Have you confirmed the receipt? Found it this morning. Purchased 3 months ago. A matching pair. The seller remembered him well. Said he made quite a show of choosing just the right symbolic gift. Miss Marple gave a thin smile. Edwin always was a man for performance. Graves shook his head. The whole village will be in shock for weeks. Perhaps, she said, but in time they'll come to terms with it, because people forget how cruel control can look when dressed in charm and manners, and Lavinia's life, though quiet, was filled with watchfulness. Graves studied her for a moment. Do you think he truly loved her? Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Then, softly, I think he loved the version of her that stayed still, the one that needed him, the one that said nothing. But when she remembered who she had been, when she considered telling the truth, he saw that version vanish. And some men can't bear to be left, even in spirit. Later that evening, as dusk painted the village in tones of lilac and stone, Miss Marple was visited by a most unexpected guest. Alaric Denham stood on her porch in a brown coat too large for his frame, holding his hat in one hand and an envelope in the other. "I wanted to thank you," he said awkwardly. "I know I wasn't exactly ... helpful at first." Miss Marple gestured for him to come inside. "The truth rarely arrives in a single step, Mr. Denham. It comes like the tide, in, out, in again." He sat gingerly on the edge of her sofa, glancing at the lace doilies and teacups as if they might judge him. "I didn't kill her," he said. "I know. She was the only person who told the truth back then," he continued. "The others all looked away, but she gave the statement. The one that cost me my job." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet you sought her out again." "I wanted her to know I forgave her," he said. "Strange, isn't it? After everything. But I needed her to know I'd rebuilt my life, that I didn't blame her for what he did." Miss Marple said nothing for a long time. Then she asked, "Did she seem afraid of you?" "No," he said quickly. "She seemed ... tired and sad, but not afraid. She asked me what I wanted. I said only that I hoped she was happy. She said she'd tried." Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. "And did she say anything about leaving?" He nodded. "She said she'd been thinking about it, that she'd written a letter. A real one, not like mine. She said it was her way of reclaiming the truth." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A letter?" "Yes. She didn't say to whom. Only that it was honest. She seemed lighter after that, like someone who had just exhaled for the first time in years." He stood, straightened his coat. "If you ever find it, I'd like to read it." After he left, Miss Marple returned to her writing desk, where a small stack of papers remained untouched since the day of the fete. Beneath them, just as she suspected, was a single sealed envelope addressed in Lavinia. Crowthorne's precise hand dot, it had been slipped into Miss Marple's post slot early on the morning of her death. With great care, she opened it. To Miss Marple, I believe you see more than most, and perhaps you've already guessed that there is something Edwin cannot allow the world to know. It is not a single secret, but many small ones. Moments of control, small violences of voice and silence. I gave up my truth to survive, but survival is not the same as peace. If anything happens to me, know that it was not my hands that chose it. I am done choosing silence." Lavinia Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it in a small tin beside. Her sewing needles died outside. The wind rustled the garden hedge. The village, as always, prepared for the next day. Gossip would swell, then fade. Life would resume. But beneath it all, a truth had been spoken. At last. Chapter 9. The aftermath. The Sunday after Edwin Crowthorne's arrest, the bells of St. Martin's rang out with their usual determined cheer, as though nothing in the village of Kettlebury had changed at all. The choir sang with practiced grace. The sermon was delivered with its customary pauses for reflection, and the faithful filed into the nave in their usual tweeds and cardigans. Yet beneath the surface of Kettlebury's well-worn civility, something had shifted, A sense of unease like a hairline crack in a teacup ran through every conversation. They still said good morning on the lanes, still stopped for gossip beside the bakery or the post box. But the warmth was thinner now, the smiles just slightly forced, and Edwin's name, when it did come up, was always spoken in the past tense, like a distant storm that had passed just close enough to singe the trees, but not flatten them. Miss Marple, as always, took her usual seat at the back of the church, and left before the final hymn. She had no appetite for being thanked, nor for enduring the covert glances that accompanied the knowledge that she had once again seen what no one else had dared to. Back at Rose Cottage, she prepared tea for one. She paused only once before placing Lavinia's final letter back into the tin where it belonged, alongside other such documents from long-forgotten cases, each one folded in quiet testimony to lives cracked open by truths no longer buried. She had just begun buttering a scone when a knock came at her door. It was Alice Breyer. The girl looked different, somehow no longer timid, though not quite unburdened either. Her hair was neatly pinned back, her blouse crisp, and her voice steady as she asked, "May I come in?" "Of course," Miss Marple said. "I've just made tea." Alice stepped inside and sat without prompting, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "I wanted to tell you something," she began. "Something I didn't say before, about Lavinia." Miss Marple listened with quiet attentiveness. She confided. "In me," Alice continued, "not just about the letter, but about something else. She said she'd once been in love with someone else, long before Edwin. She never married him. Something happened, a scandal. She never told me the man's name." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Perhaps it was Alaric Denham." Alice looked up in surprise. "She mentioned a school," Miss Marple continued. "A lost job, a girl who gave a statement." "She never said it was her," Alice whispered. "Perhaps not in words, but Lavinia's silences were always more eloquent than most people's confessions." Alice's eyes filled. She carried that guilt for years. Even after what he did, what he became, she still blamed herself. Miss Marple gave a sad smile. "That's often how it is. Women are taught to wear blame like a coat, even when it isn't theirs to wear." Alice bit her lip. "I think she wanted to be free of all of it. Of Edwin, of the past. That day at the fete, when she walked back into the house, I think she knew he would try something. But she wasn't afraid." Miss Marple poured her another cup of tea. "She wasn't afraid. She was finished." They sat together in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the gentle clink of china and the ticking of the old mantel clock. Alice finally asked, "What will happen to him?" "He'll go to trial," Miss Marple said. "But he'll be clever about it. He'll claim diminished capacity. Say it was grief or betrayal. The courts may show mercy." "And the village?" Miss Marple gave a faint shrug. "It will heal. In its way. Gossip will change focus. Mrs. Pendlebury will invent a new jam. Agnes will marry that dreadful cousin from Bournemouth. Life, even here, goes on." Alice smiled weakly. "Will you stay on at the office?" Miss Marple asked. "I'm not sure. I'd like to. Leave Kettlebury for a while. Maybe go to Devon." Lavinia spoke of it like a dream. Wild sea air, clean beginnings. Miss Marple nodded, approving. Some places do have a kind of forgiveness in their wind. Before Alice left, she turned it. The door. "I think she chose you," she said quietly. "To receive that letter, she could have sent it to the police, or hidden it somewhere, but she trusted you." Miss Marple looked at the folded paper now resting beneath her needle tin. "She did, and I'm honored by that." Alice left with a kind of soft finality, as though something had been gently closed rather than shattered. The rest of the afternoon passed in soft drizzle-dot. By evening, Miss Marple had returned to her sewing, her thread gliding in and out with methodical grace. Outside, the sound of footsteps came and went, neighbors returning from errands, the occasional clatter of bicycle spokes echoing down the lane. But the peace in the village was no longer the old, naive kind. It was the fragile sort that followed disruption, the kind that knew it could break again. And might dot at precisely 5:30, Miss Marple placed a final stitch and set down her work. She rose, stepped into the garden, and stood among the hydrangeas as the last light faded from the sky. Birds rustled in the hedges. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and fell quiet again. She thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that a sugar bowl could whistle, and how much louder silence could become when someone finally decided not to drink from the cup. Chapter 10. The Puzzle of the Whistling Sugar Bowl. 3 weeks had passed since the garden fete that ended in death. The village of Kettlebury, ever resilient, had begun its gentle process of forgetting. Not in the sense of denial, no. The name Crowthorne still made mouths tighten, but in the quiet, willful way small communities survive, by turning tragedy into lowered voices and sideways glances. Flowers had returned to the beds outside. The vicarage. The choir was rehearsing for Whitsun. Mrs. Pendlebury had begun testing rhubarb marmalade combinations no one had asked for, and in Rose Cottage, Miss Marple sat once again in her parlor, a neat pile of correspondence before her, her tea untouched. Across from her sat Inspector Graves, shoulders uncharacteristically slouched. The case, though officially closed, still weighed on him in subtle ways. "He still won't confess," the inspector said at last. "Sticks to the story. It was an accidental test. Says he only wanted to see if she'd take the sugar." Miss Marple gave a small hum. "It's not an unfamiliar game, you know." Graves raised a brow. "Poisoning one's wife?" "No," she replied, watching someone make a choice. "It's a particular kind of cruelty, one that seeks not only control, but validation." He wanted her to incriminate herself, to drink, to confirm that she had something to hide. Graves shook his head. "But she didn't." "She did," Miss Marple said gently. "But not in the way he imagined." Graves frowned. "You believe she was guilty of something?" "No," said Miss Marple, setting down her knitting. "I believe she was once a witness to something terrible, a truth no one else wanted exposed. And she carried that truth into a marriage built on silence. Her guilt was survival-shaped, not from what she did, but from what she allowed to be forgotten." The inspector leaned back, thoughtful. "She didn't drink the tea," Miss Marple continued, "because she had made her decision. She had sent her letter. She was no longer afraid. And Edwin? He couldn't bear that." Graves exhaled. "And the sugar bowl?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the small china figurine on her mantelpiece. "It's a symbol, really. So many crimes are. People don't poison others out of passion these days. They do it quietly, with porcelain smiles and measured teaspoons." He ordered the pair of bowls as a gift, remember. One whistled, one didn't, a metaphor he never voiced. Graves nodded slowly. If she took the sugar and nothing happened, he'd know she still feared him, that she still belonged to him. And if she refused, then she was ready. To go, Miss Marple nodded. And so in his mind she had already betrayed him. Silence stretched again. Outside, the branches of the fig tree tapped the window pane with brittle fingers. Graves rose. There'll be a trial. Maybe even press. Coverage. He'll wear his sorrow like a medal. Of course, Miss Marple said, rising with him. Men like Edwin always do. The inspector paused at the door. You were right from the beginning. I only listened, she replied. People rarely mean what they say, but they always reveal what they fear. He left with a quiet thank. The door shutting softly behind him. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, rereading Lavinia's final letter once more. The handwriting was small and deliberate. A woman trying to say precisely what she meant, with no room for misreading. If anything happens to me, know that it was not my hands that chose it. She folded it again, placed it back in its tin, and tucked it deep in the drawer beneath her embroidery silks. It would not be published. It would not be part of the official record. But it would be remembered. The next morning dawned crisp and pale. Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, where the new grave had been marked not with grand inscription, but a simple brass plate, Lavinia Crowthorne. A quiet soul. She brought no flowers, only silence. I knew a woman once, she said softly, who knitted lace into her pillowcases so she could dream of better things. You would have liked her. She stood for a moment longer, then turned back toward the lane. On her way home she passed the old mill road. A man in a brown coat stood there, hands in pockets, staring at the hedgerows. Mr. Denham, she said. Warmly he turned. Miss Marple. I didn't expect. I was visiting Lavinia. He nodded, voice rough. I don't think I'll stay in Kettlebury much longer. That may be wise. He looked at the sky. I came here hoping to bury something. But the past doesn't go underground just because we pretend it should. No, Miss Marple said, but it can be laid to rest properly, when all the pieces are finally put in place. He looked at her. Do you think she forgave me? She did more than that, Miss Marple replied. She remembered the truth and chose not to be afraid of it any more. That's more powerful than forgiveness. He bowed his head. Thank you. Miss Marple continued on her way. By the time she reached Rose Cottage, the sun had brightened. A bluebird settled on the sill outside her window, chirping once before flitting off inside. The cottage was still, peaceful, but not naive. She poured herself a cup of tea and smiled faintly at the sugar bowl on her tray, plain, unmarked, utterly silent. Some mysteries make noise as they arrive. Others, like Lavinia Crowthorne's last act, whisper through porcelain and stillness. A woman's quiet defiance against the man who mistook silence for submission. Miss Marple sipped her tea and returned to her knitting. The needles clicked. Softly and the village, though unchanged in its appearance, would remember just a little more sharply that even in places of jam, lace, and garden fetes, death listens, watches, and sometimes waits inside a sugar bowl. Epilogue. The tea grows cold autumn arrived in Kettlebury, with little ceremony. The roses outside the church grew darker, heavier with each passing day, and the wind carried the scent of apples and old paper. Trees along the commons turned the color of burnt marmalade. In the market square the shopkeepers exchanged shorter words, and the villagers wore their coats a little tighter, not just for warmth, but with the unconscious habit of people who had come through something quietly unsettling. The Crowthorne house remained shuttered. Its garden, once so obsessively kept, had begun to yellow and fade, untamed vines curling over the path where Lavinia once walked in silence. The town solicitor's name had been scraped from the frosted glass door of the firm on High Street. No new tenant had yet taken it up. At the vicarage, Reverend Allworthy began preparing his Advent sermons, careful to avoid any references to betrayal or sin that might remind his congregation of the summer's events. He chose parables of grace, of patience, of the humble triumphs of unseen people. But even he knew that the old tranquility was gone. There was now an empty place in Kettlebury's unspoken hierarchy of innocence, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was no bad thing. Alaric Denham left the village before the first frost. No goodbyes, no announcements. He had told only Miss Marple of his departure, and a brief note, folded once, slipped through her letterbox. "Thank you for reminding me that silence is not always shame. I will live quietly, but not hidden." The trial of Edwin Crowthorne came and went in late October. Miss Marple did not attend. She knew the court would be full of witnesses offering their versions of civility and shock, of veiled surprise and careful omissions. She knew Edwin would speak as he always did, calmly, precisely, with just the right tremor in his voice to suggest grief, and just the right absence of detail to maintain plausible doubt. But justice, in its quiet English way, did arrive. A sentence was handed down, not quite as long as it should have been, but long enough that Edwin would never again walk the streets of Kettlebury. The newspapers called it a domestic tragedy in the countryside, a headline framed by hedgerows and deceit. Miss Marple clipped the article and filed it under Crowthorne. Behind others she had kept, not out of morbid interest, but as part of her own quiet record. Human behavior, she often said, was like a garden bed. Left unchecked, it would always reveal what had been planted there long ago. As for Alice Briar, she did leave. Devon, in the end, proved a balm. A post opened at a local bookshop near the coast, and with